So VOC started in 1984. We're entering our 37th year. This makes us one of the older, if not oldest, organizations in Colorado that does what we do. And there are a lot that do what we do these days. I'll get into that a little bit on down in the presentation. But specifically in 1984, there was a national effort spearheaded by the Appalachian Trail Club and the Mellon Foundation to identify areas where there are additional opportunities for volunteer stewardship and organizations to promote that. And it dovetailed nicely with an initiative that Governor Lamb at the time had through his Office of Volunteerism. And so, you know, that is in a nutshell how VOC was born. And we've been going strong ever since with a mission to motivate and enable people in Colorado to be active stewards of their state's natural resources. And again, I'll get into what that looks like here in a minute. But where we're based, I'm coming to you from our Denver office. We're headquartered, if you're familiar with Washington Park, we're headquartered in the bathhouse building, which is right near the corner of Downing in Virginia and Washington Park. And this is where the bulk of our staff works. The bulk of our programs are executed out of here. We certainly engage a lot of volunteers from the Front Range and the Denver metro area. But we also support 2 partnership offices in other parts of the state. One in Monte Vista, working in coordination with, we have a staff person working in coordination with the Rio Grande National Forest and the Bureau of Land Management out of Monte Vista, serving those 2 land agencies in the greater San Luis Valley area. And we have a position that runs an office in Greeley, Colorado, working with the Greeley Department of Natural Areas and Trails and serving that department and a number of other partners in Weld County and environs. And so in all that time since 1984, we're closing in on 200,000 volunteers engaged at this point, you know, in thousands of different types of volunteer projects in trails, parks, and open spaces and wilderness areas all over the state, and a donated labor value of over $25 million. And that obviously continues to grow as our programs continue to be put out there each and every year. And we had a little bit of a reduction in programming with COVID-19, and we had a brief shutdown we usually run from April to October in terms of our project season. We had a brief shutdown April through June and got going again in July with some smaller programs, but happy to report we kept things going, kept everything afloat. And as we move into this year and learn more about how COVID-19 has spread and all that, you know, have some good fortune to be an outdoor focused organization where our risk of transmission is much lower. And we're not quite there yet, but we're pushing our way back towards kind of normal programming and what that looks like. And we're hoping to be kind of fully operational again in 2022. And by fully operational, I mean kind of larger volunteer group sizes. We still brought all of our staff back, and we have a full season of projects and other programs this year, but it's at a little bit smaller group sizes, as you can imagine, with the ongoing pandemic. So there's a few different ways that we accomplish our programs. The most well-known and most forward-facing of this is our volunteer projects. As I said, we run these from April to October. They come in many shapes and forms, which I'll get into as we progress. We also have a statewide training program where we train volunteers, employees, and youth corps members with the different types of leadership and technical skills that are needed to be successful in this type of work. We have a scholarship program that we offer to both graduating high school students and to non-traditional students. And what I mean by that is college students who find themselves in another part of their life other than graduating from high school and then seeking resources to attend college. We offer scholarship opportunities to students who are looking for careers in natural education to provide career skills in natural resources. And so these are kind of 3 of our big forward-facing programs, and there's a number of other things we're involved in as well. But the first 2 volunteer projects and the statewide training program are kind of going to be the focus of what I'm talking about with you guys today. So specifically, but I wanted to discuss some of the issues that we try to address and why what we do is really kind of important and why it matters that volunteers are getting involved at all, why volunteers are needed to be pitching in this area. And so this diagram is kind of trying to show the variety of pressures that are being placed on Colorado's natural places and natural resources these days. And so, as I'm sure you're all aware, we've seen in the last many years quite substantial increased population growth in the state. Combine that with increased tourism and the increased importance of tourism for economic development for numerous communities around Colorado, and you see increased recreation and a number of impacts from that increased recreation. We also look at projects that are not on the recreation side, but more on the habitat restoration and environmental side of work. And one of the large driving factors that we're seeing there, of course, is not just the increased population, but also climate change and other impacts that are putting stress on natural habitats and other resources. And at the same time, as you may know, the major sector that's managing public lands and natural resources is the government at the federal, state, and municipal levels. And especially at the federal and state level, you continue to see diminishing funds available, especially for employing boots on the ground and hiring people to go out and work on issues. And so with all these things in play, the need for volunteers to get out there and get their hands dirty is only. And this is especially true, and I'll come back around to this, but as you may know, with COVID-19, with a lot of other things closed and shut down, and us all living where we do, I think a lot of people were reminded that the outdoors is always there and isn't going anywhere. And so this may be something that you've experienced yourself when you're out there, huge crowds in outdoor spaces, long lines of entry, full parking lots, so on and so forth. And so in the past year especially, we saw on the recreation side negative impacts of overuse growing quite a bit. And so that's led to now even more stress and more strain on these resources, and again, a larger need for volunteers to get involved. And so when we look at the project types that we're engaging in, we try to kind of think about what we're doing from a variety of different lenses. And what I'm going to present here, it's not the limit on those lenses, and I'll get into a few other things as well, but this helps, I think, kind of encapsulate, okay, what are the issues that we're out there all over Colorado trying to address in a given year. And I should say, if I back up a little bit, our programs are statewide. We're based in Denver, but we set up projects in every corner of the state. And the first part of that is watershed restoration. And we specifically kind of look at what the Colorado Water Conservation Board has to say about what priorities in watershed restoration should be. And so that's restoring stream channels, providing habitat for aquatic and terrestrial species, restoring riparian areas. Riparian areas, if you're not familiar, is that kind of narrow buffer along streams that provides 2% of Colorado's habitat, but is utilized by 80% of Colorado's wildlife, and so is a very critical strip of habitat wherever it's found. And reducing erosion, flood hazards, and increasing the capacity to utilize water in all of these areas. So as our population grows, as we have, unfortunately, increasing and prolonged drought, and it's especially occurring on the western slope this year. But there's many areas of the state that can experience drought at any given time while stress is being put on that water supply. Finding projects where we can help restore native habitat, increase the ability for water to be utilized, and really kind of these areas of providing habitat, restoring stream channels, reducing erosion, and increasing the capacity to utilize water. That's where kind of these projects come into play. And in a minute, I'll talk a little bit more specifically about what that looks like. We also look at habitat restoration outside of strictly stream channels and watersheds. Again, I'll get into some more specifics there, but anywhere where we're addressing issues like habitat fragmentation, removal and treatment of noxious weeds, and other restoration projects with goals that are more exclusively focused on wildlife in non-riparian habitats. Responding to climate change has become an increasing focus of the organization in the last few years. And when I say that, we're one of the major things that we're looking at is responding how we can to wildfire pressures. I'll get into that a little more specifically, but when we look at climate change, some of the big ticket items are healthy forests, fire mitigation and fire restoration. We've also done flood mitigation and flood response over the years. And an interesting one that's come up recently, there's a number of partners along the Front Range that are working towards trying to build a bank of native seed for disaster response in terms of wildfire. When you're going to rejuvenate and kickstart a fire damaged landscape, you really need a bank of native seed to be able to spread out there and help the native species start to come back. But the only way to really source that is to collect it in the field. There's not, a lot of vendors just sitting around with piles and piles of native seed. And so that's another thing volunteers are really useful for, is getting out somewhere and just harvesting native seed where it lives and shipping it we'll ship it back to our partners who maintain it in a seed bank that can be used for disaster response. And finally, recreation. And VOC's kind of original focus and our continuing kind of bread and butter in terms of where we really get a lot of volunteers out is in recreation, specifically around trails. And there's a few, but other elements as well, and I'll get into some of those more specifically, but there's a few things that we try to address when we're talking through recreation projects and deciding where we're going to deploy volunteers in a given year. But one of the main ones is, and that's been there for a long time, is positive development for shifting rural economies. We're seeing over the years, and it's certainly not going away, but communities like this picture taken in the Arkansas Valley are having to look at shifting away from an extractive economy, mining, timber, agriculture, towards a more recreation focused economy. And in Colorado, that typically tends to mean one big thing is trail access. And in this case, this picture is a relatively recently built mountain biking trail outside the town of Buena Vista, Colorado. And so that, people coming from out of the community to visit the mountain biking trails, the idea goes, and it bears out in some research that we've done. We'll visit those communities, buy lunch, buy coffee, maybe go pick up some gear for their bike or spend the night in a local hotel, all those types of things. So recreation in the warm months, in addition to the winter months, is increasingly important for former extractive economies in rural areas. We also, though, want to look at creating inclusive recreational access, both in terms of what communities have access to it and what kind of people can access recreation. And I'll provide a few more examples of that a little down the line, but this particular picture is taken in an area near the Montbello neighborhood in Denver, where a trail was built in partnership with the City of Denver and the Arsenal National Wildlife Refuge, where there was really no local trail access within easy walking distance of that neighborhood. And so this was an effort to provide that. And that's a continuing initiative that we see both from Governor Hickenlooper, who had his 13 in 30 initiative to create key trail connections, 13 key trail connections in 30 years, to now Governor Polis, who I believe has an initiative to have parks within walking distance of every Coloradan. Recreational access is continuing to be a pretty big issue at high levels in the state, and so it's something that we continue to respond to. As I discussed as well, addressing issues of overuse it continues to be critical. This picture is taken on top of Pikes Peak, where you have soils that won't ever regenerate now that they've been denuded. And just generally speaking, maintaining, restoring, rerouting, and closing unsustainable trails and other recreational infrastructure is a big thing that we do. So segueing from that into some more specific types of projects, the trail side of things really comes down to trail construction and maintenance. In the center here is that same area that I just mentioned near the Montbello neighborhood, where volunteers are not only building a trail near that neighborhood, but in that case, a very accessible trail. If you see, you can kind of see that material they're using there. The intent there is that it can be hiked, biked, wheelchaired, whatever the case may be. We've also looked at access in terms of a lot of our state parks partners are putting in track chair trails where folks who need to use one can use a chair that rather than wheels has kind of, if you've not seen it, kind of like tank tread tracks on it that are a little more robust to be able to go into different environments. So accessible trails, but also we send crews out into the deeper backcountry occasionally, like this crew on the right hand side of this picture, using primitive tools to clear trails in parts of the managed lands where motorized tools are not allowed. And so we have to get volunteers back in there to clear trails to maintain access to our state's wilderness area using non-motorized equipment. Just a couple specific examples. In terms of habitat restoration, some recent, both in riparian and non-riparian areas, some recent examples. On the left-hand side, we partnered with a group called the Southern Plains Land Trust out near the Oklahoma Panhandle earlier this spring. And these volunteers are putting structures out on the prairie to help slow water in place, to help not only increase its use for that habitat, but also to let it stay in the system a little bit longer. This is where they were working on a tributary above John Martin Reservoir. So the longer that water can stay within its watershed and move more slowly towards the reservoir, the more that water can be utilized both for habitat and agricultural purposes in that environment. In the center, volunteers are just out in the mountains removing some redundant barbed wire fencing that was no longer needed. When barbed wire fencing is no longer needed for agricultural purposes, all it is an obstacle to migration by hoofed mammals like elk and deer. And so by removing barbed wire fence, you can make a significant habitat improvement for those types of animals. And then on the right, with some of our partners with Greeley, it's a classic planting project. These volunteers spent the day out on the river, putting trees in the ground and improving the habitat along the Poudre River watershed in the Greeley area. I wanted to kind of give some examples specifically about what we do with fire restoration. There's a couple different things going on there. On the right, we had a crew up recently just reseeding land that was recently damaged by the Cameron Peak fire in the Red Feather Lakes area. So this crew spent 2 days spreading that native seed that I discussed to help kind of kickstart the restoration and rejuvenation of this landscape. On the left, a new thing for VOC has been getting volunteers trained and out with chainsaws in partnership with our partners at the Forest Service to help reduce the fuel load in forests. As you may know, the type of forest management in a lot of the 20th century was suppression, which led to less fires. But now that we're also grappling with increased climate change issues, when these fuel loads get too high, when they can't get periodic low intensity fires in these areas, and the fuel loads just continue to build and build and build until there's these massive high intensity fires. And so this particular picture was taken just up the road from Denver in the Buffalo Creek area, where there's residential areas. We can't really do a prescribed burn in here. Well, that means people got to get out and actually cut some trees down. And so volunteers were out there doing that, and we'll be continuing to work in that area as well. We introduced community science as part of our programming. Volunteers are getting out and doing everything from inventorying campgrounds for our partners to inventorying abandoned mining features, inventorying different types of habitat indicators, to in our San Luis Valley office that I mentioned, we send volunteers up in the mountains to collect water quality samples. And not only is this just kind of an interesting and different type of programming that we've started to deploy, but I think again is indicative of just how difficult it's getting for government agencies to perform this work. I mean, this would have been the job of, like the water quality sampling, for instance, would have been the job of some sort of ologist position at the National Forest, and they can't now even afford to hire that person. And so volunteers are now needed to go out and do that. So it's just it's a big net of things that volunteers can help with, and that we're trying to find ways to pitch in on all around the state. And again, to make all this happen, we have to manage a pretty robust training program. So not every volunteer that we engage has to be trained. In fact, on the bulk of our projects, no training is necessary to just attend as a volunteer, but we do need to train the volunteers who want to be crew leaders, who want to run saws, who want to come out and show others how to do that work, and fulfill other roles. So every year we have 20 to 25 different training sessions around the state where we provide that instruction and education for volunteers that need to or want to receive it. And a lot more. You know, that's really just kind of scratching the surface, but some other things I wanted to mention. You know, we have and last year we did not run our youth programs as part of our COVID-19 precautions, but this year we're happy to be bringing those back. We engage youth as young as 6, either as pictured on the left hand here, a group of kids that came out with their families and participated in an environmental education program while their parents were out doing trail work. We have a program that engages high school students in the Denver metro area by application, and every month from September to April they meet and do a different type of project or other type of environmental education program, and that culminates in a volunteer project that the kids plan themselves. And then one of the big things that we're looking at these days in all of our programs is who are we serving and how can we be more inclusive and more diverse, both, you know, racially and ethnically in our programs, but also in the type of service that we're providing to all sorts of different people and in the communities that we're serving. And so identifying partnerships to both increase the diversity of our volunteer pool, but also to think about what's the big takeaway, what are the objectives beyond just the purely environmental and recreational that we're providing in our project. So by way of example, in the center here, we've always had a urban gardening program in place where we planted demonstration vegetable gardens in different city parks and other areas of Denver with a group called Grow Local Colorado. But in this case, we're also looking at providing access to healthy food. And I believe this picture was taken at a women's shelter here in the Denver area. So it gives those residents in that space, we're helping them kind of kickstart this garden and not only give them access to healthier food, but also to have that outlet of being able to get involved in gardening. And on the right, we had a crew out at a state wildlife area earlier this spring, and they constructed some handicap accessible platforms at a state wildlife area for fishing and wildlife viewing. We also piloted this year a program where we had deaf and hearing impaired volunteers come out and work with us as part of an American Sign Language crew, and where we had some volunteers who were fluent in American Sign Language to help us recruit the interpreters that we need, put together the resources, and make sure that those folks who are deaf and hearing impaired had everything they needed in place to participate just like anyone else on one of our trail building projects. And so, you know, expanding that program on both ends so that we're not, you know, just hitting all these environmental boxes, but also reaching new and diverse audiences and really making this something that the broadest range of people possible can get involved in. How am I doing on time, Fletcher?
You're doing fine.
Okay. So with all that in mind, I did want to kind of give an overview of who we work with and how we get out there and find all this work to be done. The first is our kind of big three. These are our three most significant partners in the state of Colorado. The U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, who between them manage something like 20 million acres of public land in Colorado. So most of our public land is managed by the federal government, and these two manage the bulk of that. And so by extension, we do a ton of work with them because the majority of the areas that we're working on are in public land and they hold the most. We also work quite extensively with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. I couldn't find a number on how much land Colorado Parks and Wildlife manages. Certainly the state of Colorado manages quite a bit of land in Colorado, but there's something like 45 state parks and hundreds of different state wildlife areas. And they also support us a lot through the a state trails program that they manage for funding different trails-based initiatives around the state. We do a lot of work with municipal governments, a variety of stripes. These four on the Front Range are pretty significant ones, but just a small collection of the different municipal governments that we work with: Greeley, Denver, Colorado Springs, and the city of Boulder. They're a good example of kind of year in and year out partners, but Town of Castle Rock, Costilla County, all sorts of different municipal level partners are also on our roster of partnerships. Another area, and I mentioned one of these earlier in part of the presentation, but land trusts are starting to become increasingly significant partners for volunteers for Outdoor Colorado. If you're not familiar with land trusts, they do a few different things. They will either purchase and or work with private landowners to hold land in trust for environmental purposes. So they'll either purchase private land and then hold it in trust for conservation, or they'll work with private landowners to put what are called conservation easements on land, where the private landowner has agreed through the deed of the land to meet certain environmental quality objectives and goals. And so these are two examples: the Mountain Area Land Trust and the Southern Plains Land Trust, of two that actually manage a pretty good chunk of land that they have purchased. And so, for instance, with the Mountain Area Land Trust, they purchased a lot of land in Park County near Fairplay, where we've started to build out recreational access in partnership with them for that community. And the Southern Plains Land Trust, who manage a pretty significant swath of land in the southeastern corner of the state, where they're taking agricultural land and where they can buy it up kind of in this patchwork of properties that they own. They're holding some land for continued sustainable agricultural use, but they also hold some land for purely trying to return it as much as they can back to its natural shortgrass prairie state. And then finally, as I mentioned, there are a number of groups in Colorado that have similar or identical missions and models to Volunteers for Outdoor Colorado, a real alphabet soup, if you will. And these are just an example of a few that we work with on a pretty regular basis. The Colorado 14ers Initiative, who have the mission of specifically addressing recreational and environmental needs on Colorado's 14,000 foot peaks. Continental Divide Trail Coalition, that has stewardship responsibility for that trail. If you're not familiar, the Continental Divide Trail runs from New Mexico to Canada on the spine of the Rockies, and they're based here in Colorado. The Poudre Learning Center is one of our big partners in our Weld County program. They had managed a section of land along the Poudre Learning Center that they hold for both local recreation and environmental education. And Wildlands Restoration Volunteers is based in Boulder, or no, not anymore. They're based in Boulder County now, housed in Longmont, but another example of a group that does work in a similar model to us, and that we collaborate with a lot, especially in volunteer training. And so these kind of partners, not only the ones that we work with, but this is a big element of how VOC is funded. We work a lot of government contracts, government grants, government partnerships, and fee for service. Other big buckets for our funding and how we accomplish the work that we work with, we get a lot of foundational support, again, through grants and other funding sources. Corporate funding, a variety of businesses will donate to VOC. And then individual donations are another big area of how we source funding, and do a variety of donation campaigns and membership campaigns and that sort of thing. And so between government, corporate, foundation, and individuals, those are kind of the four quarters of how we source funds for our work. So for this last bit of the presentation, I just want to talk a little bit about how volunteers specifically can get involved with our programs, talk about our project models, how volunteers can come out and actually participate, and then I'll leave some time for questions at the very end. But we host at least 60 projects on our calendar each year that, there are some exceptions where you have to have the right kind of training, like in our SAW projects, to come out and volunteer. But the bulk of these, anyone who meets the minimum age requirement and feels they have the appropriate physical capability, and we provide that information on our website. When volunteers register, they can read about, is this an physically easy to up to physically difficult. As you can see from the pictures here, there's a wide range of physical tasks that are done. Some of these projects are just come out on a Saturday or a weekday for about 8 hours and accomplish a specific scope of work. Others are morning and evening, where we just kind of come out and set something up for a handful of hours and get some good work done. especially when we're working in different corners of the state, further away from the Denver metro area. We set up overnight weekend projects where volunteers will come and camp out for the weekend and then work at the site where we're camping. And then that can be extended anywhere from 3 to 5 days, depending on the scope of work, where these 5-day projects are typically, and we just had one recently, a small group of 15-ish folks will, put all their gear on their backs, and plus or minus the engagement of a horse packing crew, they'll pack into some, stretch of the wilderness and camp out for 5 days and perform some projects in a more remote setting. And so those volunteers that do come out and spend time with us, we find you get a lot out of it. Not just a sense of accomplishment, fresh air and exercise. We try to make sure we're spending a lot of time educating volunteers on, how we do what we do and why it's important, just kind of like I've discussed here. They get to meet like-minded people from around the state, care for their favorite places and discover new ones. Try to hook people in with the free meals on all these overnight projects. That's always a big winner. If you can come, you can show up, we'll take care of everything else as far as planning goes for food and everything like that. And it's just a lot of fun. I think we get that year in and year out, that people continue to come back because they're having a good time while they're doing it. And I'll leave you, before I turn it over to questions, I see we have about 9-10 minutes left, that I'll leave you with this quote from one of our longtime volunteers. He always likes to tell people, if you give one day with VOC, you can hike anywhere in Colorado guilt-free for the rest of the year. So that's where I'll go ahead and leave it. I had a little bit more, but since we're coming up against it, I'll go ahead and leave it there and then open it up to any questions.
Well, thank you, Dan. That's wonderful. I'll lead off with the question. All right. The only reason I know about VOC is our mutual friend Gail. All right. And she's here listening in, by the way. So
I saw her. Hi, Gail.
And I was wondering, how do you get the volunteers? How do you?
Sure.
That's a lot of people, a lot of work, and she's told me about it, what she does and all. I know there's, she's mostly in the kitchen, all right, which is a lot of work as she described it. But how do you find the people to get all this work done? I mean, it's amazing.
Right. I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to answer that. One, we're lucky that at least at this point, we've been around for nearly 40 years. And so we've built that community over time, grown it, sustained it, nurtured it. And so we get a lot of name recognition and a lot of word of mouth just by that alone. The other thing that we have in our favor is that we're based in the largest population center in the state. And so we're really working out of the Denver area to then deploy people around the state. Now, that's not to say that all of our volunteers live in the Denver area. There's plenty that live all in other parts of the state, but that's kind of the bulk of our recruitment efforts. Beyond that, it's a lot of legwork. And I think one thing that we do that not a lot of other volunteer nonprofits do, and again, I think this is just both foresight, but also just luck to have the resources available. We have two people who in two slightly different roles, but they come to work every day and recruit, and they do it by media releases, social media, earned media, making phone calls, sending emails, posting on websites. I mean, really spending their 40 hours a week focusing on recruiting people in a variety of different means. And there's a lot of different strategies around that, but the main thing that we do is we give to people the time to deploy those strategies, see what works, see what doesn't work, and they're focused on that day in and day out.
Okay, very good. Any other questions?
What about the pine beetle? And is there any work going to control that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it shows up in a couple of different ways. Certainly in those forest thinning projects that I mentioned, some of those it's called the prescription for the forest. The land manager will say, here's our prescription for what needs to be done, and that may entail, all these trees here were killed by pine beetle and they need to be, cut down so that they're not just sitting here fuel for fires. But, unfortunately, a lot of it, it comes around to our response on the other side, because there's just so much of it. And that's really the challenge with the wildfires that we're seeing now, it got to a point from, both pine beetle and also, forest management practices combined with declining capacity to do it, that you're not going to be able to address it until maybe the forest is burned down, unfortunately. And then we're coming in and doing the erosion control, the planting, the seeding that is then necessary to kind of rejuvenate the forest.
Thank you.
When you say, I always wondered, you say you cut down the trees, the beetle kill trees, or you're thinning the forest. Where do the trees go? What do you do with the trees? You can't just cut them down and lay them there.
Right. It just depends. You'll see different things. For instance, the city of Denver mountain parks, they kind of want to give all their parks a haircut on a rotating basis, is how they like to describe it for us. And so they have the volunteers, or sometimes the youth corps will get in and cut down the trees. And in this case, we're not talking anything huge. It's a lot of kind of fist-sized saplings that are overgrown to maybe up to 12-inch diameter trees. But in any case, they have machinery that they'll drive in. The crews will have piled the down trees where it needs to go, and they'll turn it into mulch where it sits. Other groups will pile it up and burn it. Other groups will haul it out. And there's a lot involved. We're not the only crews doing this. There's a lot involved, like in logging contracts for some of this, where either for firewood or for other purposes, contracted logging crews are coming into these areas because they can use some of this salvage wood. Or in the case like this, the project in Buffalo Creek that I mentioned, there's nothing wrong with the timber. It just needs to be cut in a specific way.
Okay. Okay.
I was also curious about how you recruit your volunteers. So Fletcher, that was a great question. But it takes full-time staff, right? That's really.
It does. And I think, when VOC started, it was, and we still rely on, one thing I didn't get to is kind of the volunteer leadership structure. But we still rely on volunteers for a lot of the running of projects and the planning of projects. We have a full-time staff when we're at capacity. Right now we're working on some new hires, but of about 14 to 15 people, only maybe 5 of those will see a volunteer project as part of the course of their normal employment, and usually only one at a time. So if we've got a group of like 120 volunteers, that requires a lot of volunteers to come in and help us manage that. But over the years, as we've added more staff capacity, that does allow us to do more. Right, where in the past we do a small number of very large projects, maybe 20 projects in a year. Now we're doing 60, 70 projects in a year plus other things, and yeah, that the staffing capacity is really a big part of that.
Yeah. Big project.
Any other questions?
Yeah, where do we go to volunteer for the seed stuff? Is there training for that? Like kind of pull the seeds out of these acorns and stuff.
Yeah, it just depends. That happens in a specific part of the year, and we're not doing much of it right now. But there's another group. I'm putting a few links in the chat box. Certainly, I should have put that somewhere in the presentation. But you can go to www.voc.org to find out about us, our projects that are scheduled, what we're doing, where you can get involved.
Perfect.
Seed collection more specifically, I wanted to throw out, I mentioned wildlands restoration volunteers. They're doing that a lot more than we are. So WLRV.org, if that's something specifically you want to check out, I also recommend them. They do a lot more seed collection than we do. That being said, I encourage you to check both websites out. And if you want to learn more about VOC, we're at voc.org.
Now, is there on the government funding and everything for hiring people and as such, is there efforts being made on the federal, or to approach these guys and say, we need money, we need money? I'm sure that's being done, but it just seems really odd that we're cutting so much funding.
Right. It's an interesting conundrum, because our mission is specifically to get volunteers involved, right? And we're not a lobbying organization. So we're not going to Congress and saying, you should fund I'd love to see them give more money for the service, but right now the bulk of the money is really going to, fire, a lot of money going to fire, and then a lot of money going to contractors that's where we can, us and a lot of other groups can plug in an interesting way. That
Mhm.
field office that I mentioned in the Rio Grande National Forest, that is a staff position embedded in that office. So her name's Katie Goodlife. She works in their office.
Uh-huh.
And they contract with us. We raise some of the money and they give us the rest. So for less than it costs them to hire a full-time employee, normally they can have a full-time employee who's dedicated to working with them. So that's one strategy that is, and then that just means the money's getting moved from different buckets. We're kind of navigating that government red tape to funnel that money into where it can be put to productive use.
Huh.
So, and other groups are hiring, you know, that seasonal employment model that the government used for other nonprofits are just getting in on that. And they're coming and they're hiring the staff that replaces those, you know, that might have formerly been hired directly by the government.
Yeah.